Chapter 8 The Broken Bird. September 12th, 2060. San Diego, California, North America. I want to go back. Out of the question. Let me go back to the island, please. Do you even hear what you're saying? Do you even care? Akira stared at her father with newfound hatred. Blake tried to convey how much she was hurting him, but Akira ignored him. The Archangel had landed in the ruins of San Diego on the Pacific coastline. Two more ships, the Hyuga and the Crusader, were nearby. All three crews were trying to celebrate their victory over a bonfire as the sun went down, but the sense of triumph was ruined by Akira's contempt towards her rescuers, not to mention what she'd done to her eldest brother. Alexander had just barely survived his fight with Akira. During those frantic, bloody moments on Kauai, Akira managed to gouge his right eye out with her bare hands. Her older brother nearly bled to death, and was saved only by a transfusion from Chris Wright, who had compatible blood. Both men were completely exhausted and were passed out by the fire. Alexander's face was caked in dried blood, and a hasty eye patch was covering up the wound. Chihiro and Blake tried to speak to their daughter, but she was completely close to them. Following her mother's telepathic assault, Akira created new mental barriers in her mind, determined to shut out everybody around her. She could feel her mother constantly trying to probe her mind, but Akira was having none of it. Psionic feedback jumped from Akira to Chihiro, and her mother would recoil from the shock. "Akira, I know you might have grown to think better of those people," Chihiro started to say, but Akira cut her off. "Shut up! Shut up! You don't know anything!" Akira screamed at the top of her lungs. "You just murdered all of my friends and blew up the only place where I was ever happy! I hate you! I fucking hate you so much!" Chihiro looked like she was going to burst into tears. "But, honey, those people, they were..." Again, Akira cut off her mother. "No! Don't you dare! Don't you fucking dare!" Sobbing, Akira ran away from the group and boarded the Archangel. She locked herself in the living quarters and threw herself onto the bunk still marked as hers. She wanted to cry, to mourn Rafi and Sally Ann and the others. She wanted to see them smiling and happy again, and felt so terrible that the last time she saw the wonderful men and women who loved her so much, they were begging for mercy just before they were executed in cold blood. Akira could hear her parents' voices outside as they talked to their friends and family. She overheard Julian the android suggesting Akira be made to see a therapist. "The girl is clearly traumatized and suffering the continued effects of Stockholm Syndrome," Julian explained. "She needs multiple sessions of therapy." "What about me?" Alexander said. "She put my eye out. Can't I sock her in the face, Dad? Just once?" "No," Blake responded. "Dr. Teigen can make you a new eye when we get back to Kansas. But what I really think Akira needs right now is time to reconnect with her friends and family. Her real ones." At this, Akira put her face in her pillow and screamed. The next day, the Archangel returned to Manhattan. Autumn was arriving early in Kansas this year. What few trees still stood were now adorned in colors of red and orange, while the surrounding fields were muddy and waterlogged. The days were still lethally hot, so Akira once again found herself made to walk underneath canvas canopies and awnings, at least for the few hundred feet. Once Akira was back inside the walls of Myron, she started pulling herself away from her parents, who instinctively let go when Akira stepped into the deadly sunlight. With a click of her fingers, Akira summoned a telekinetic shield and positioned it above her head, keeping her safe from the sun's deadly rays. Blake, Chihiro, and Alexander all looked at her, visibly confused. "What's wrong with you?" Alexander said. "Aren't you happy to be home again?" Akira scoffed and walked away, taking a shortcut through the sun-bleached square to get away from her family. She wanted nothing to do with them anymore. The tenement house was exactly as Akira left it back in June, overcrowded and noisy. She was planning to lock herself in her old room until she decided what to do next, but she never got the chance. A flurry of platinum blonde hair swept across Akira's field of vision before she found herself on the receiving end of a dive-tackle hug. Scarlett Freeman squealed with delight, seemingly oblivious to Akira's passive reaction. "You're back! I'm so happy to see you!" Scarlett jumped for joy and hugged Akira once more, then launched into a barrage of questions. "Where did they take you? Did they hurt you? Are you okay? What happened? Tell me!" Akira remembered Scarlett and wondered just how she had ever been friends with her. But she found that she just couldn't be angry with Scarlett, no matter how much she wanted to be. After all, if Scarlett had not stolen Emmanuel Espinosa from Akira, then she might never have fallen for Rafi. Her voice dripping with contempt, Akira asked, "How's Espinosa?" Scarlett's face fell. Akira felt a building sense of triumph as her former friend replied in a weak tone, Well, he told me..." Scarlett trailed off. Akira wanted to know the answer. She had already guessed the outcome, but she wanted the satisfaction. She wanted to hear the words herself. Using telepathy, Akira broke into Scarlett's undefended mind. The young girl's mind was seemingly transparent, and Akira could read all of her thoughts and memories with very little effort. Very quickly, Akira found what she was looking for. The memory was only a few weeks old, so it was still fresh. Akira could feel the mental and physical anguish emanating from it. She saw Scarlett and Emmanuel wandering around the trade center together at midnight. Scarlett revealed her secret feelings for him, ready for him to reciprocate, but instead, Emmanuel gave a nervous laugh before asking Scarlett to sit on a bench with him. It was then and there that Emmanuel said, "I'm flattered, Scarlett, I really am. But I'm too old for you. You know that, right?" Akira felt a deadened recreation of the emotions that rocked Scarlett as she realized she was being rejected. Over top of Scarlett's anguish and misery, Akira felt her own satisfaction. So, Scarlett had failed to steal Espinosa from her. Well, at least one good thing came from all this. Akira turned away from Scarlett, who was still recovering from the mental invasion, and started wandering towards her own room. "What the... Akira, what was that?" Scarlett called to her. "What did you just do to me?" Akira didn't reply. Instead, she began to laugh. She laughed at how the events of the past 2 months played out. She laughed at the conclusion of her love triangle with Espinosa and Freeman. She laughed at how all of her family and friends expected her to just carry on with her old life as though nothing had happened at all. As she stepped into her old bedroom and locked the door behind her, Akira pressed her back to the wall and sank to the floor, still laughing, because she had finally accepted a horrible truth. It was something that she had been suspecting ever since she returned from Kauai, ever since her mother's telepathic assault left a trail of devastation through Akira's consciousness. This truth explained her newfound contempt for the people she should have loved, and it revealed how she was able to mentally assault her former best friend without an instant of hesitation or remorse. Akira's mind was broken. How exactly, she didn't know. But nonetheless, her conscious mind was somehow damaged to the point where it had been changed, and Akira suspected there was absolutely nothing she could do about it. Slowly, Akira's laughing turned into tearful sobs. She threw herself onto her bed and wept until she fell asleep. Meanwhile, on the other side of the colony, Blake Robinson and Chihiro Tachibana were about to enter the XCOM building when a man caught up to them and delivered a message. "Your daughter is in her room in the tenement. Locked herself inside, and we think she cried herself to sleep." Chihiro sighed and gave her husband a worried look. Blake nodded and then replied, "Thank you, Mr. Freeman. You should go check on your daughter." As Scarlett's father left, Blake and Chihiro maintained a worried expression all the way to their destination, a conference room where several other veterans of the Second Hyperspace War were gathered. The former commander of XCOM was seated at the head of the table, and she gestured to a pair of free chairs as the Robinsons entered the room. Laura Harper was an old woman now, nearing the end of her life. A pair of armrests on her seat gave away the fact that she was occupying a wheelchair. The elderly leader continued where she'd left off. "The terraforming engine completed a static test today," she informed the group. "I'm told by Dr. Tigan that he has high hopes for our next test, and that he will require additional raw materials for the next run. I'll pass around that list shortly. But first, we need to discuss the raid on the Exalt facility on Kauai Island. Lieutenant Robinson, Corporal Tachibana, is your daughter well?" "No, ma'am," Blake and Chihiro replied together. "Akira has gone through extreme mental trauma," Chihiro explained, "including psionic assault." "Her behavior matches that of someone with Stockholm Syndrome," Blake added. "She's tricked herself into thinking she was in a romantic relationship with one of the Exalt operatives." "How?" asked a voice from down the table. Holly Smith, former leader of the Stormbreakers, looked alarmed. "How the bloody hell could Exalt do something like that?" Someone else raised their hand. Chris Wright stood up and spoke. "When we arrived, we noticed a device on the mountaintop that was dispersing psychoactive gas across the whole island," Chris explained. "I think it's safe to say that everybody on the island, even the Exalt leadership, was under the influence of this drug. It would explain why the people were so passive and willing to accept whatever they were told." "They called it sweet air," Inez Vasquez chimed in. "We heard 3 of the rescued victims tell us it was the best air they ever smelled." "Which victims?" inquired Central Officer Bradford. "Sepulveda, Tsiajotso, and Etienne," Inez replied. "They're all here in Myron now, but we don't know how to rehabilitate them. They're brainwashed very badly, just like the Robinsons kid. They all want to go back and live on the island again. Tsiajotso said it was like living in a perfect utopia." "Sure, a utopia kept alive by raiding nearby shipping lanes and kidnapping people," Bradford scoffed. "Sounds more like a bandit kingdom to me. So, how do we deprogram these people? Anyone have any ideas?" The leaders of XCOM collectively scratched their heads for a few minutes before someone had an idea. Lily Shen, the chief engineer, held a tablet computer above her head and spoke up. "So I was looking through some of my dad's old files, and in one of them, he mentions that XCOM experimented with waking up humans afflicted with the sleepwalker virus in 1962. Maybe our science team knows how to do it." Dr. Tigan, the chief scientist, folded his arms in thought. "I strongly doubt my predecessor could shed light on the matter," Tigan replied. "The atmospheric device on Kauai bears her fingerprints, both metaphorically and literally. However, I think we might cast our attention onto the first chief scientists of XCOM. I am talking, of course, about Dr. Heinrich Dresner and his compatriot, Dr. Alan Weir. Their work with Zujari technology and the sleepwalker virus were groundbreaking. I believe I share my companion's convictions. We should consult the oldest of XCOM databanks." Blake stood up. "I know where they are. Site X." Bradford cocked his head to one side and gave Blake a quizzitive stare. "Robinson, Site X is A, buried underground, and B, literally 100 years old. There's no way any data down there has survived this long." "Remember the technology of the times," Blake replied. "Back in the 1960s, XCOM didn't have high-volume data disks or portable hard drives. They would have kept all their information on paper, and in a dry environment like the Nevada desert, that paper might still be salvageable. Commander, with your permission, I'd like to take the Angel out to Site X and try to recover the sleepwalker data." A murmur of assent went around the conference room. In general, people seemed to like Blake's idea, but Laura had one more thing to say. As she addressed Blake, Everybody could feel a gentle psionic pulse emanating from the elderly commander, as though the ethereal being locked inside of her was stirring restlessly. "I can see your hopes, Robinson," she said. "I know you think this knowledge will help your daughter, and there's no harm or shame in that. I only ask that you keep in mind that Akira is not the only one who is suffering. We must help the other victims we found on that island. Find whatever information you can about curing the sleepwalkers. If any of that data can be used to help the victims of the sweet air, bring it back to us as quickly as you can. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am." Early the next morning, Akira was woken by loud knocks on her door. "Go away," she cried out. "Leave me alone." "Akira, we're leaving," Blake called through the door. "It's a short mission to Nevada. Pack a few days' worth of clothes and meet us on the runway. Wheels up in 1 hour. Don't make us come looking for you." For a few minutes, Akira wondered what would happen if she simply refused to leave her room, but her question was answered by a noise coming from the bedroom window. Servo motors and the clunking of heavy metal told her that Julian was lurking outside, and that he would probably just reach in the window and grab her if she refused to budge. So Akira reluctantly packed a backpack and stepped out the door. As she departed the tenement, Scarlett Freeman did not speak to her former best friend. In fact, the young blonde withdrew into the safety of her room and held the door shut until Akira was gone. Out on the airport runway, the Archangel was being loaded up with fuel and cargo when Akira arrived. All of her siblings gave her a wide berth as she approached. Even the twins, James and Josiah, seemed to regard Akira with newfound apprehension. Only Asuna attempted to say hello. The eldest Robinson child placed one hand on her forehead and then moved it forward as though she were making a salute. It was the same gesture Asuna used to say hello. Akira barely acknowledged the greeting, simply nodding her head. Then she boarded the spaceplane. To her surprise, there were 2 more people on board. Chris Wright and Emmanuel Espinosa were both in the crew quarters, strapping themselves in for takeoff. "Asuna loves these sorts of missions," Chris said, "so I thought I'd tag along." Akira tried to move on and find a seat when Emmanuel gently grabbed her wrist. "Hey, Akira," he said quietly. "I know you've just been through hell, and if you need to talk to someone, I'm here for you." Akira didn't know why this made her feel so angry. It just did. She wrenched her arm free and moved on, pretending she didn't hear Emmanuel's words. Akira didn't get to sit down for long, though, as Blake spotted her when he boarded the ship and said, "Hey, why not come up to the cockpit with me, Akira?" It was the last thing she could have wanted. To spend time with the people who had murdered her friends and lover? She was so full of anger and hate that when Akira arrived in the cockpit, she didn't even look at her mother. Blake, who had been planning to offer Akira her first flying lesson, seemed to realize the moment wasn't right, and he settled for the next best thing. He asked Akira to strap herself into the engineer seat at the back of the cockpit and watch as he flew the spaceplane. "Someday you'll have to fly this thing yourself," he said. The flight was painfully awkward, but mercifully short. The flight took just 2 hours, and the whole time, Akira sat quietly in the back of the cockpit while her parents took turns trying to engage her in conversation. But Akira had nothing to say to them. Nothing would ever make up for what Blake did to Sally Ann, or how Chihiro had butchered the only person who ever truly loved Akira. She wasn't really paying attention to where the spaceplane was going. Akira was vaguely aware of the grassy plains giving way to rocky and mountainous desert below, but when the Archangel flew low over the ruins of Las Vegas, she sat up and took notice. The city itself was wrecked during the war, and no one ever returned to it. Over the past 50 years, the Nevada desert slowly reclaimed the city. Most of the high-rise buildings had collapsed, and a layer of dirt and sand covered the rest. None of the streets were visible, and vegetation grew out of control everywhere. After circling around, looking for a place to land, Blake and Chihiro pointed out and agreed on a space of flat desert about 60 miles north of the Las Vegas ruins. Akira had no idea why her parents wanted to land so far away from the city, but she would soon find out. To the north of Las Vegas was a stretch of desert that looked far different from the rest. Hundreds of craters pockmarked the ground, making the region resemble the surface of the moon. Some craters were small, while others were hundreds of feet across. In the midst of these massive craters, a small complex of buildings could be seen. The Archangel touched down just 5,000 feet short of these structures and used her parachutes to slow down to a stop. Once the spaceplane came to a halt, Chihiro declared, "We're here!" Where exactly was here? Akira's curiosity grew so great that her anger was momentarily forgotten. Nobody asked her to follow them, and yet she followed all the same. Blake, Chihiro, Asuna, Alexander, James, Josiah, Chris, and Emmanuel all walked towards a seemingly unremarkable shack. There were no windows, only a single, heavy-looking door. Plastered across the front of this door were big block letters that spelled out the words, "Bureau of Strategic Emergency Command, authorized personnel only." And underneath of it was an insignia, a white five-pointed star rising above the continental United States, along with the words, "Vigilo Confido." Blake pushed the door open, revealing a set of stairs that led underground. "Welcome to the original XCOM headquarters," he said. Or what's left of it, anyway.